Welcome back to the class video for Module 13, in which we're looking at Publius's The Federalist Essays. In the first part of class, we looked at Essay 1 and 9, and this description of this crisis historical moment, this Machiavellian moment in which Madison describes the descent of democracy into anarchy and his proposal for his solution, a confederated republic. In the second part of class, we looked at essay number 10, which addresses majority factions, and this recurring phrase, extend the sphere or enlarge the orbit. And we saw how Madison inverted fundamental assumptions of Western political philosophy dating back to Aristotle. We come now to the final essay in the assigned collection, Federalist essay number 51, and the key phrase here is the compound republic, which refers to the system of federalism, that is the relationship between the federal government and the state governments, but the root concept here is the principle of checks and balances. You will recall that the revolutionary state constitutions in Pennsylvania, New York, and as well as the Articles of Confederation, by and large rejected the principle of separation of powers or checks and balances because they were operating within an Aristotelian framework in which the powers to be separated are the one, the few, and the many. And the revolutionary constitutions did not want to share power with the one or with the few, and they put the largest share of power in the hands of the many. That overwhelming authority of the democratic element is exactly the disease that Madison described in essays 1 and 9. So the burden on Madison here is to reintroduce the principle of checks and balances, separation of powers, but to try to persuade his audience that it's not a return back to the old Aristotelian framework of one and few, many, but is instead a progressive turn forward to something new, to be able to retain the principle of separation of powers without invoking that older pre-revolutionary paradigm. So let's turn now to the text of Essay 51. If we pick up at the top of page 11, we find Madison essentially what sounds like in the middle of a discussion. And indeed, 51 is the culmination of the couple of previous essays in which he's introducing this subject and essentially going through all of the problems with confining the executive within the executive branch, confining the legislature within the legislative branch, etc., etc. So now, after having outlined all of the conceptual problems, he turns now to introduce his solution in the first highlighted passage. To what expedient, then, should we finally resort for maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among the several departments as laid down in the Constitution? The only answer that can be given is that as all these exterior provisions are found to be inadequate, the defect must be supplied by so contriving the interior structure of the government as that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. And with this introduction, Madison introduces a radically new and distinctively American solution to the problem of sovereignty. The primary conceptual distinction in this passage is between exterior provisions and the interior structure of the government. Now, what does that mean? We've been asking since the beginning of the course with Locke and virtually every reading since, what power is strong enough to constrain the most powerful thing in a person or institution in society? That thing must be sovereign. But how can you control the thing that is sovereign? Think of Locke and the problem of creating an umpire and who shall judge. Or think of the conceptual problems with Rousseau's general will, which he would ostensibly make superior to government, but can't define the thing in any tangible way. What is the force that is beyond the most powerful thing in society and can constrain that thing? What Madison declares here at the beginning of 51 is that that's a fool's errand. That's a quixotic mission to look for such exterior provisions. The umpire who can blow the whistle and wear the striped shirt, because the umpire is not part of the game. There is no feature of government. There is no institution or person within society who is outside of society and can be objective and independent and act as the constraining force. Giving up on that quixotic mission leaves only one alternative: to construct the interior structure of the department, of the government, so that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, keep each other in their proper places. There will be no referee. There will be no umpire. We're simply going to empower each element of the government and rely on the strength of that element to fight against the other elements of the government, and that back and forth, each unit or institution attempting to preserve its own space will provide the interest or the incentive to check the other branches. And so there's a parallel or an analog here in this solution to the problem of separation of powers and checks and balances to the embrace of pluralism that we saw in Federalist number 10. Rather than trying to force everybody to think the same, to condense the interests in society to as few as possible, to get them as close to one as possible, the American solution is precisely the opposite: to proliferate and encourage as many different interests as possible. We want endless numbers of interests in hopes that the competition among all those interests will have the effect of canceling out the vicious ideas and allowing only the virtuous, those in the pursuit of the common good, to come through. So there's an analogic or parallel kind of conceptual thinking in both 10 and 51. We are not going to recognize an umpire. We're going to give up the search for an independent umpire, and we're going to rely on the competition of individuals to provide security for the continuance of government. And so he's going to kind of divide the rest of the essay in half. In the first half, he lays out a series of features of the Constitution within the text of the Constitution that Madison proposes will provide this interior structure. If we look in the next paragraph, he's going to talk about how each of the offices are selected. He says in the highlighted passage, "It's evident that each department should have a will of its own, and consequently should be so constituted that the members of each should have as little agency as possible in the appointment of the members of the others. Were this principle rigorously adhered to, it would require that all the appointments for the supreme, executive, legislative, and judiciary magistracies should be drawn from the same fountain of authority, the people, through channels having no communication whatever one with the other." And then continuing on in the highlighted section, "Some deviations therefore from the principle must be admitted. In the constitution of the Judiciary Department in particular, it might be inexpedient to insist rigorously on the principle." So here's another dilemma of democratic government. All officers of government should be chosen by the people, if the people do indeed rule. But if you simply allow popular elections for every single office, you will merely replicate the same principle for each office. So how can we have different channels drawn to the people? Well, we've seen 3 examples of that. We've seen how the House of Representatives is based on the census and this combination of the principle of property and personhood. We've seen in the Senate that each state legislature gets to choose its senators however it will. So in a kind of model formula, though they could vary from it, the people of the state vote for their state senator and legislators, and then their state legislators get together and choose their federal senator. So there's a channel back to the people, but it's not the popular election that we have for House of Representatives. And of course, there's a third model with the Electoral College choosing the president, right? You have separate elections, however the state legislatures determine for those delegates or those electors to the Electoral College. And then we leave it in the judgment of each elector in the Electoral College to choose the president. So there's a channel back to the people, but it's not a direct channel. But of course, the one place where this principle is grossly violated, not even observed in the least, is the selection of the federal judiciary, where the president appoints and the Senate confirms. So now, if you want to call that a channel back to the people, it is a very distant, the most distant channel back to the people. But of course, once chosen, federal judges do not face election again. They serve for life terms. And so Madison has to make this exception. Some deviations from the principle must be admitted in the Constitution of the Judiciary Department in particular, and we discussed that when we were talking about the federal Constitution. There are good reasons to think that the judges should not be liable to popular elections. We do not want judges making decisions on what the majority believes about the law. They should be making decisions on the principles of the law. So this is Madison's way of trying to make the claim that the officers of the federal government are popularly elected, but through these sort of serpentine channels that people can influence, but there are various screens and barriers before the people get their direct will. So the first example of this interior structure of the government are the 4 different methods by which officers in the federal government are chosen. At the top of the right-hand column of 11, he says it's equally evident that the members of each department should be as little dependent as possible on those of the others for the emoluments next to their offices. And so that is responsible for those clauses in the Constitution having to do with the legislators, the president, and the judges' pay. But we come to the meat of the argument here in the next paragraph, the middle paragraph on the right-hand column of 11. But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist the encroachment of others. And then this wonderful famous line from the Federalist essays at the bottom of that paragraph: in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. It's a great line, and it should recall to you Rousseau's discussion of the particular will, the general will, and then that third thing, the corporate will, right? That interest that members of government have in being members of government. And so this phrase, you enable the government to control the governed, but you must oblige it to control itself. And the solution is in the next paragraph. This policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives might be traced through the whole system of human affairs, private as well as public. He says at the top of the left-hand column of 12, it's not possible to give each department an equal power of self-defense. In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. The remedy for this inconveniency is to divide the legislature into different branches and to render them by different modes of election and different principles of action as little connected with each other as the nature of their common functions and their common dependence on the society will admit. But as the weight of the legislative authority requires that it should be thus divided, the weakness of the executive may require, on the other hand, that it should be fortified. So notice the kind of anti-democratic bias or anti-revolutionary bias of Madison's perspective here. The legislative authority necessarily predominates, so we have to weaken it. If you think that the legislature represents the many, right, and the executive is associated with the one, then what Madison is arguing for here is to weaken the many and to strengthen the one. You will recall from both Dickinson and Paine's writing that one of the great objections to the power of the king was the king's veto over colonial legislation. And in both the New York and the Pennsylvania constitutions, we saw how that veto power was carefully regulated within a kind of committee or separate institutional structure. In New York, the governor was allowed to play a part in this review of legislation to determine whether they're constitutional. And in the Pennsylvania Constitution, the executive had no role in reviewing legislation. The veto is the prime symbol of the king's monarchical arbitrary authority. It was taken away from the executive in the revolutionary state constitutions. And here's Madison now arguing that we need to reinvigorate the executive, because notice, now that it's an executive, Madison is hoping you won't associate it with kings or monarchy. It is this other thing. That won't fool people like Melanchthon Smith in the least. And when the Anti-Federalists read this paragraph, they see Madison as arguing against the success of the revolution, against one of the foundational principles that was established in those revolutionary constitutions. We need to weaken the legislature and strengthen the executive, Madison says. Notice, too, that Madison does not give the answer that we modern Americans might give to this same question of who superintends or looks over the relationship between legislature and executive. We would say, well, the Supreme Court has the final word. Madison does not position the Supreme Court in this role, which further emphasizes the observation that we made when we looked at the federal Constitution, that the federal Constitution nowhere bestows upon the federal judiciary the power of judicial review, which is indeed its most significant power that it exercises today. Madison here does not imagine that the Supreme Court will serve the role of umpire over these other two branches of government. He imagines that by weakening the legislature and strengthening the executive, he's making it a fair fight, right? And there is no referee in the combat between them. He's simply trying to make them equal opponents. So that's a list of specific provisions of the Constitution that Madison thinks fulfills this vision of an interior structure of the government in place of some kind of exterior provision. And then he turns to two other themes at the bottom of the left-hand column of 12. He writes, "There are, moreover, two considerations particularly applicable to the federal system of America, which place that system in a very interesting point of view. First, in a single republic, all the power surrendered by the people is submitted to the administration of a single government, and the usurpations are guarded against by a division of the government into distinct and separate departments. In the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, and then the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself." And from this paragraph, we get this famous phrase, the compound Republic of America. And again, we want to think about, we raised this issue back when we were talking about the revolutionary state constitutions. There's a kind of two-dimensional game in designing one government. Say, take any particular state government or take just the federal government. A two-dimensional game of dividing the three branches, checking and balancing them, establishing different rights. It becomes a three-dimensional game when you take that Republican government, that democratically valid government, and you try to create tiers of government and relationships between them, which is the core idea of a confederacy. So what Madison is saying here, this phrase, the compound Republic of America, refers to the federal balance between national and state governments. Both the national government will be constructed with these interior provisions. Hopefully the state governments will adopt some like them or have their own interior provisions. So they are each internally controlling themselves And in addition, the double security is their intention with each other. So the principle of federalism becomes here an example of separation of powers, checks and balances. That notion is embodied in the phrase, the compound republic of America. And in Madison's final point, we come back to the concluding theme of Federalist number 10. He says in the next paragraph, second, it is of great importance in a republic not only to guard the society against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of the society against the injustice of the other part. Different interests necessarily exist in different classes of citizens. Continuing with the highlighted passage, the second method will be exemplified in the Federal Republic of the United States. Whilst all authority in it will be derived from and dependent on the society itself will be broken into so many parts, interests, and classes of citizens that the rights of individuals or of the minority will be in little danger from interested combinations of the majority. So just as we saw in the concluding sections of Federalist 10, cultural pluralism, that is, the proliferation of diverse groups and ethnicities and religions and economic interests and every kind of difference that you can imagine among people. The proliferation of differences, the embrace of heterogeneity, the embrace of diversity is itself a kind of separation of powers, checks and balances. And that reinforces the theme of extend the sphere, enlarge the orbit, the bigger the voting district, the better, in the succeeding paragraph. This view of the subject must particularly recommend a proper federal system to all the sincere and considerate friends of Republican government, since it shows that an exact proportion as the territory of the Union may be formed into more circumscribed confederacies or states, oppressive combinations of a majority will be facilitated. Continuing with the highlighted portion. In a society under the forms of which the stronger faction can readily unite and oppress the weaker, anarchy may as truly be said to reign as in a state of nature where the weaker individual is not secured against the violence of the stronger. It is no less certain than it is important, notwithstanding the contrary opinions which have been entertained, that the larger the society, provided it lie within a practical sphere, the more duly capable it will be of self-government. And happily for the Republican cause, the practicable sphere may be carried to a very great extent by a judicious modification and mixture of the federal principle. So not only are we going to encourage diversity, cultural diversity, and pluralism, the bigger our country is, the more diverse and pluralistic it will become. So if we want to maximize freedom, if we want to control factions, if we want an interior structure of the government that will, through competition of rival interests, keep itself in check, then we ought to be contemplating the largest possible extent of territory to bring under this new federal government. Ideally, something about the size of a continent should do the trick. So the principle of cultural pluralism circles back around in Madison's presentation to become a reinforcing element of separation of powers, checks and balances. This is a uniquely American solution to the problem of who shall be umpire. Who shall be umpire according to Publius? Nobody shall be umpire. Indeed, we are going to so complicate and proliferate differences in society that no one person or group will be able to claim to speak for the common good. Only when those rival interests cancel each other out can we hope that wise and enlightened people will rise to office and help us to transcend our partial interests and find some common vision. This is a solution that you have seen nowhere previously in your foundations reading or here in your development readings. It's a uniquely American solution, and that's why we call this presentation, this perspective on constitutional order, the Madisonian turn. This is the moment when American politics diverges unalterably, irrevocably diverges from the older Aristotelian tradition and becomes something unique, new, modern, and will become the primary model by the time we come to the 20th century, the primary model for global politics. All right, that concludes our discussion of Publius and concludes the course. Congratulations on making it to the end of the final video. All you have to do now is write your textual genealogy and prepare for the final exam. Congratulations on completing the course.